So yeah, my name is Kyle Bunk, and I am a animator at Firaxis Games at the moment, which we generally use 3D animation, but yeah, my presentation has nothing to do with 3D animation. It's actually involved in pixel art. So I want to give people kind of a little bit of a background on myself. So this is before I even entered college or anything like that. Like during my early days in high school, I would hang out in a lot of these spaces, like DeviantArt, especially Newgrounds. And from there, I kind of taught myself a lot of things like Flash and sort of traditional animation stuff. And this is actually the oldest thing on the internet that I've ever made. It's not even really animation, it's more just like clip art, just moving. And it was from an English project. I had to recreate something from Macbeth. And I did it pretty accurately, but I had Macbeth say the F word at the end for some reason. I don't know, I thought that was really funny at the time, when I was a kid. And it worked on Newgrounds, so. But from there, I kind of wanted to do something more, that's what I wanted to do professionally. So I ended up going to a 2-year school in Delaware with the intent of transferring those 2 years into a bigger college like Pratt Institute or Academy of Arts or SVA or something like that. But unfortunately, because of just personal financial constraints, I couldn't do that. So I had to find other venues to kind of express animation. So I ended up going to Animation Mentor, where I transferred most of my 2D skills into 3D animation. And that ended up landing me in a job at Gameloft, which was a studio in their studio in New York City until they closed down. And then I've been looking for work for quite a bit until I was picked up by Firaxis, where I worked on the expansion for XCOM 2. But in between that time, I actually was looking for work, but I was also doing these pixel art things over the time. I would do these over the internet. And I'm actually wondering, how many people have actually seen my stuff? Oh my God, that's a lot more than I thought. Okay. See, I get the numbers on my phone, but I don't actually see people that are, so it's kind of nice seeing an actual number. And here's more. So I'll let this play for a little bit. So the reason why I wanted to go over my background was just to tell you guys more kind of what I went into pixel art knowing. Because I wanted to do pixel art. I had a lot of friends of mine who were really into it, and I kind of wanted to jump in. But I had to kind of know my limitations. I knew animation just through 3D and my days doing pencil and paper animations. But the main challenge for me is that I wasn't really a designer. I couldn't really come up with a character or an original thing. So that's kind of why most of my animations are based on existing properties like Overwatch. And past that, modeling, texturing, and rigging was a kind of game development pipeline that I'm not really familiar with. I know enough to do some basic effects, but to do anything sort of pixel art sprites with 3D was kind of outside of my realm. And another thing that was very different was when I first started doing animation during my high school days, the internet was really different. You would have animations would actually last quite a bit. Flash videos would be 2 to 3 minutes or even longer. And nowadays, everything is in a GIF format. So everything went from 2 to 3 minutes to 3 seconds. So I had to really fit my skills into a different sort of medium that the internet sort of became. So what I want to say is that whatever you know, whether it be traditional animation or 3D or whatever it is, you should really base your pixel art on kind of that skill set that you have. So I have 3 different examples. I have this sprite from King of Fighters, and that's basically using modeling, texturing, and that standard pipeline that you can make really amazing stuff out of it, but that just wasn't my skill set. And I wasn't really an illustrator, so I couldn't do like the amazing backgrounds that you would see in Hyper Light Drifter. But for something like Marvel vs. Capcom, where the characters are relatively simple, but also have really robust movement, I could kind of pull off something like that. So I think what I want to say is that you can be creative with pixel art, like no matter what your skill set is. And I actually included Mortal Kombat sprites, because those are basically just mocap people with like cool costumes, I guess. So if you're like a good costume designer, you can do that. And even mixed mediums, like you have, oh my God, I can't believe I don't know his name. Is it Sub-Zero? It is. I feel like the ice would be obvious. But yeah, like you have something that is basically a motion captured guy, or not really motion captured, like like an actual person doing an ice blast, and then somebody had to do the animation for the ice on top of it. And you can get really cool results with that. And for those of you, sorry, tripping over my words. For those of you who see my Mercy pixel art, I don't know if many people know this, but a lot of the effects that come off of her were actually done in the Unreal Particle system. And it was like the first time that I actually used something outside of just straight up drawing it. So usually the way I start is this is for like my McCree animation. I wanted him to do like a roll and like a gun shoot backwards. So there's actual footage of me kind of rolling forward and going backwards, and it's like not really that great, to be honest, but it was better than nothing. So to kind of go on top of that, I looked at other things that really inspired me. Like one of my favorite animated sequences of all time is the Asuka final fight from End of Evangelion. And there's like this really cool roll that was done by Mitsuo Iso, and I wanted to incorporate a lot of that as well into my role for McCree. So, but before I even go into the animation process, I want to figure out kind of the design. I know I said I wasn't really a designer, but something that that already exists is a lot easier to do that. So I kind of just came up with this still image that I was going to worry about animation later. So with this still image, I also kind of figured out the colors that I was going to use. So I would use something called index colors, where basically I would just restrict myself to these set number of colors. And I think the number here is like 32 colors, so it'd be 32-bit, I guess. I don't know if transparency counts, but so indexing your colors is actually really important for pixel art, because if you get really far into your animation and you realize, wow, that red kind of sucks, like you can actually go into your palette and just do a color change, and it'll change every frame simultaneously, so you don't have to like go back and recolor everything. So if you do want to do pixel art like this, definitely do that first. So when I do animation, oh, wait a minute. Oh, there's a slide transition. So something that I think a lot of people are fascinated with is that I actually use Flash to do most of my animations, not just because I originally started out on Newgrounds, so I kind of have a bias towards it, but also vectors don't do this. Like, when you do pixel art, you can't really rotate or scale anything. If you rotate it, like the pixels, they just kind of get messed up. Like there's just not enough data for it to like cleanly kind of translate. And if you do this enough, like you'll just kind of end up with like a mess of pixels. Like don't even think about scaling it, because like scaling it just absolutely destroys it. So that's important to me as a 3D animator as well. I want to be able to not only draw my stuff, but to also be able to rotate, translate, and scale these things, like just in each frame, to be able to get the best possible movement. So for a while, I do stick to vectors. The thing that stinks about being in vectors for a while, though, is that whenever you export your thing into a more pixel program, you end up with this Antialias Hell image, where like everything is just really blurry on the edges and even on the inside, which like looks fine in most art, but in pixel art, it's kind of hideous. So, but we'll worry about that later. That's kind of another step. So in actually doing these animations, I keep in mind a lot of these principles of making sure that your pose and your animation just stays very clear, just based on a silhouette. And even the effects, I make sure read really well, since you know, it's only going to be seen on one end. I don't know if 3D games worry about this too much, since you can see kind of the character in every single angle. But for something like this, it's really important to nail down your silhouette. And I even have a bad example of a silhouette. This is like midway of McCree's roll. There's like a frame where you just can't, he just turns into like a giant black ball, which I wish I could figure out, but. So another thing is making sure that you're spacing your frames. I haven't done the effects yet, so you see like kind of the crappy placeholders there. But like spacing is really important, because without it, you kind of get a really awkward movement. Like the image to the right is just all the spacing just put the same, and you can kind of see that it looks really robotic looking. Like she goes into this anticipation and then lifts off, and then she like just rises kind of slowly. It looks really robotic. So definitely when doing things like this, keep in mind your spacing. So, so smearing, this is something I don't know if 3D games worry about too much, but in 2D games, when your frame rate is really limited, it's pretty important when you do a big transition between frames. Like the top frame, you can see when the character is lifting his sword and swinging down, it just kind of blinks to it, and it's kind of jarring, just because like there's not enough frames to be able to show that actual sword swing. So for something like that, I would actually put in a smear, just to kind of communicate that motion blur. And it also is really good for sort of hitboxes if your sprite is intended for a game. So smears also don't really have to look particularly good. Here are some of my worst smears in all of my animations. And actually, fun fact on Facebook, somebody paused on that Genji like pose and then posted it, and he's just like, look how big his butt is. Like, I felt really embarrassed, and I stopped doing that. So, yeah. But I mean, with that said, like when you're doing an animation, you should smear as much as you can. I don't think people pausing on your animations and saying like, look how bad it is, a smear, shouldn't really stop you from doing that. So another thing is overlapping action. I'll show you a GIF that I did that is pretty much nothing but this, but I wanted to show an example of when you don't have overlapping action. When you have all of your parts kind of just swinging and just translating at the same time, you kind of get something really weird looking, like it doesn't look natural. So when you do something overlapping, you really do want to break up the timing as much as you can. So this is the animation that is basically nothing but overlap. Like the way she grapples with her hook, pretty much beyond that, there's not really any movement besides like the actual hook itself. So everything is overlapping with it. And you can kind of see a very close relationship between this and the previous example that I showed. And I did want to go back and try to remove all the overlap in this animation, but it would have been just way too much work, and it just wouldn't have looked good at all. So doing the so once you do the animation stuff, that's when the cleanup begins, and it sounds as tedious as it is. Basically, you have to go to every single frame and do this. So usually starting out with, sorry, losing my train of thought. So when I showed you guys the like badly anti-aliased image, the way that I usually kind of fix it up is just to do like a general marquise, like a magic wand effect around everything, and then just expand it 1 pixel and then delete everything. It usually gets rid of most of the anti-aliasing, but like it might take away more than you want. But when you're cleaning up the edges like that, I think it's better to take away more and then add later, rather than take away too little and you just seeing like blurs still on the edge. So I don't know if I actually mentioned this, but the program that I primarily use for all this cleanup is Asaprite. It's a program that is on Steam, and I really recommend it. It's like $15, and it has a really robust timeline if you want to kind of do pixel art on your own. So from there, once I remove the anti-aliasing from the borders, I try to go into the colors and try to really define them in the very beginning. Like in this picture right here, I have there's a very clear distinction between the green hues and like the bright pinks. I burped there. And like the black sort of silhouette in the back. So from here, I'm just basically trying to break up all the colors from one another and getting rid of all the aliasing from the drawing. So, and also another note, remember alpha channels. Like, a lot of my original GIFs were pixel art, but they're all rendered on a white background because like, I didn't think that people would, I figured they would just be used on the internet. You know, people would just share them on the internet. But it turns out people like taking these sort of animations and putting them on their Twitch streams. And because of that, you really do need that transparency for something like that. So if you do pixel art, like just do a transparency. Don't put it on a white layer. So from there, after I divide up all my colors, I really have to think about like how to do my shading for my sort of style. Like there's different things that you can do. You can do hard gradient, which is basically you just go ahead and you try to find the color that's in between the two and you just kind of make this banding look. Or you can do something called dithering, where dithering was something that was done a lot back then because of color restrictions. Like a lot of game artists, they wanted to have like this sort of gradient, but were really restricted by colors, so they had to do this. And in some cases it looks good, but I find that a combination between the two looks best. So here's an example that I kind of pulled off the internet like an hour ago of like a sphere that uses both dithering and also banding. And I think it's an interesting look, and you can kind of play around with the different amounts of like whether you want dither or band. So what I ended up settling in on was actually more banding, just because the hard thing about dithering is that it looks kind of strange when you animate it. I think there's a way to do it, but for me, it was just such a pain, like making sure every dot lined up, like each frame. So I ended up just going with a sort of banding, sort of hard gradient with my final output. So, and yeah, I did say that going frame by frame and doing these cleanups is just as tedious as it sounds. But there are ways to kind of save time if you can. Like something that I did with my diva animation is I actually made a 360-degree turnaround, which every frame of this is drawn, but I can just take pieces of it and reapply it into my animation. So here's an example of that, where she lands and turns around and flies off. Like I'm able to just use all those pieces into the actual animation, and it saved me more time in the end to just do that 360-degree. And then also, like if I want to do another one, I have that library and I can just kind of paste it on my frames wherever. So another thing you can save time on is just straight up cheating. This actually happens really fast in my Mercy animation. She actually spins her staff, and these frames are right next to each other. Like, the tip of the staff, it just magically teleports to the other side. But it doesn't really matter because it goes so fast, nobody's like ever caught it until now. So, oops. But yeah, since it's 2D animation, you should definitely take advantage of the liberties that you get with this, because this is something that I think is very hard to do with 3D. Like, with the amount of technical restraints and rigging and stuff, there's a lot that you can do with 2D animation, so definitely don't forget that. And so we're back to this gun. And here's the one thing that I find that is really nice about kind of the data loss that you experience with reusing assets and like kind of translating and rotating things is that like you kind of have to go back and clean it up a little bit, but the resulting image, you kind of have a new picture in and of itself. So like if you do want to have an arm that rotates or something, you don't like have a bad like bone animation where it's just like a vector sort of translating. Like it actually feels like every frame is new because you did end up doing that cleanup. So I guess that didn't really save you time. The next thing I want to show you is a more sort of advanced thing that I've done very occasionally, but I didn't have the patience to do this all the time, was subpixel movement. So this is basically when you're moving pixels, you're super restricted with the amount of space that you can move an object. So say like you want to actually make your image move half a pixel. Well, you technically can't move half a pixel. So what you can do is actually break up the pixels that go up or translate within your animation and even have colors in between. Like you can see in the highlight, there's like kind of a mid-tone between the highlight and the actual color itself. So it does give the illusion of half pixel when in actuality it is not that. So, so one thing I want to say is some good resources that really helped me out with this process was, I don't know if many people are familiar with Mini Boss's sort of pixel art tutorials, but this guy that goes by the handle of Saint 11, he's been posting these really cool pixel art tutorials every week, and they've been really, really, really helpful for kind of the things that I've been doing. And also, if you just want more reference for sprites or sprite animation, you can also go on Fighter's Generation that just has a huge collection of like fighting game sprites from all different sorts of games. So those two websites have proven invaluable to me. And other thoughts, these animations do take a long time to make. I've been getting better and better at it, so they've been taking me a month rather than like 2 to 3 of them. But I think the main takeaway from this is that I want you to be able to like do pixel art based on whatever knowledge base you have. Like, you know, I'm a traditional animator, like that started off on Newgrounds. So when I do my pixel art, it's always like in the realm of animation. But if you're an illustrator and you want to get into pixel art, you should try out pixel backgrounds or illustrations or whatnot. And another thing that was very valuable for me was just to show people my animations. Like, even if they weren't animators, they always had a really interesting opinion of how to improve my animation or what was not working with it. And that has really helped me out in this whole endeavor. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk. Wow. I have 6 whole minutes left. So I guess I can take questions, I guess. Like if anybody has any questions to ask me about my process or just anything related to this.
What frame rate do you prefer to work at?
I prefer 30 frames a second because that's just what I use in games. I'm just really used to that frame rate that I've just stuck to 30 frames a second. There have been cases where 30 frames just wasn't working, so I would just make the frames like even faster. So I'd get like a really weird number, like 38 frames a second. But the thing is, like, it's going on video, so it doesn't really matter as much. So, yeah, I'm pretty fluid when it comes to frame rate. So,
Okay.
hello.
Hello. You say you use banding to do shading. Do you typically standardize how many bands in your gradients to use? On a larger model, would you use more bands?
My main thing is just not to go crazy on it to the point where it's literally a gradient.
Okay.
Like, at that point, it's like you're kind of defeating the purpose of using pixel art.
Okay.
But usually I have like 1 or 2 bands in the middle. That just kind of works for me. I think the Diva one, I only really used a highlight, a midtone, and then a shadow. And for the most part, that works with most of my animations. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
How would you say your exploration in this way informs your day-to-day, like day job?
I actually started incorporating 2D into my pipeline for 3D. Like, I will shoot reference, but then my reference isn't good, as you've seen. So I'll actually like go into Flash and actually make like a crappy stick figure animation to kind of just give me an idea of the timing that I want. And from there, I'll look at both the reference and that animation and try to bring that into 3D. So I guess that's how it's affected my day-to-day job, is that I actually do use traditional animation for my planning.
The program that you use, it's called a sprite, or what is it again?
Hey, I don't know either.
The,
It is pronounced, it's like Asaprite, I think. Let me go back to this slide. I can show you like how
The question I have is, what did you use before that? Because I'm just now hearing about that, and I feel like Photoshop is pretty difficult, and that's all I've been using so far.
Yeah, the difficulty with Photoshop is that the layers and the timeline are very separate. Like, they're very separate entities. So Asaprite is the way that its layers are, like, its timeline and its layers are kind of on top of one another, so it's a lot easier to kind of maintain and edit your timeline in Asaprite. So,
And it limits your amounts of colors you can use too, it seems?
yeah, you can actually
That's
go in and restrict your palette count if you want to. And it even comes with pre-built ones. Like, you can actually go in and it has like the original Game Boy. Like, you can actually set your palette and then, oh, I'll just do that.
Sick.
Yeah, it's a really handy program.
Nice, I'll check it out. Thanks.
I think that's it. So, thanks, everybody.